Welcome to the video Defining Doping. The main objective of this first video is to help you to understand that what we call doping is a result of a socio-historical process. Even though the different definitions of doping are much clearer today than they were in the past, they are complex. The limits of doping are continually being questioned. What is considered legitimate to obtain a certain level of performance remains controversial. So as to understand the difficulty in defining doping, I've chosen to begin this course with interviews carried out in 1962 by two French journalists, Robert Chapat and Lucien Gavinet, with some of the best cyclists of the time. This should allow you to distance yourself and come to understand how cyclists in the 1960s were confronted with issues around doping. We'll see that in the 60s, substance use was beginning to be condemned, and yet there was still great difficulty in defining what doping was and was not. Such is the case of Jacques Anquetil, 5 times winner of the Tour de France, who, as you will see, hesitates when it comes to defining doping.
Jacques Anquetil.
Le doping, il faudrait savoir ce que c'est exactement. Je crois qu'on fait beaucoup de publicité autour de ce mot doping.
Jacques Anquetil is not the only one to have doped. For example, Oscar Plattner, a Swiss cyclist several times sprint world champion, also talks about how some people seem to confuse doping and taking vitamins.
Oscar Plattner, vous avez été plusieurs fois champion du monde de vitesse pour la Suisse, mais je crois savoir qu'en Suisse, on ne comprend pas le doping comme partout ailleurs.
Je crois en Suisse, la plupart des personnes, ils mélangent le doping avec les vitamines, parce que le vrai doping, ça c'est, je crois, c'est vraiment une chose qu'on doit jamais accepter dans le sport. Et les vitamines, c'est un renfort, un nourriture renforcement, n'est-ce pas, que les coureurs ont besoin, surtout les coureurs de 6 jours qui courent 10 et plus 6 jours par l'hiver, n'est-ce pas?
Obviously, we can suspect Oscar Plattner of trying to fool the journalist and the audience listening to the show. But other testimonies really show that the limits between what was acceptable and what was not were fuzzy. In the same interview, Jacques Anquetil, who won the Tour de France several times, tells us that cyclists had to take substances to be efficient. The journalist asked, in the time trial stages in the Tour de France, for example, or in the Tour d'Italie, or in the Grand Prix des Nations, or for the hour record, have you ever raced without any stimulants, other than your own self-esteem and class? Jacques Anquetil answered, stimulants are necessary in order to achieve great performances. Otherwise, previous performances would never be beaten. Jacques Anquetil's words would create a scandal today, but they obviously didn't at the time. Of course, what Jacques Anquetil actually meant by stimulants would need to be clarified, but it is fairly clear that norms in terms of what doping was were not fixed. Of course, cyclists could be thought to be pretending not to understand what doping was and to believe that audiences were more naive than they really were. But there are many other examples, such as Dr. Dumas, physician at the National Institute for Sports in France, who testified of the very uncertain definition of doping. As you will notice, Dr. Dumas focuses on the distinction between amateurs and professionals.
Docteur Dumas de l'Institut national des sports. Le doping très répandu chez les sportifs, donc, l'est-il en même temps chez les amateurs et chez les professionnels?
Là, il y a deux problèmes. Il y a deux problèmes parce qu'une fédération doit s'occuper des amateurs. Elle est responsable des amateurs. Lorsque les parents nous envoient des gosses pour pratiquer un sport, on doit les surveiller. Lorsqu'il s'agit de professionnels, ce sont des gens qui ont une profession, qui travaillent. On n'a pas les mêmes droits sur eux qu'on a sur les amateurs.
The distinction that Dr. Dumas makes between amateurs and professionals seems to suggest that amateurs must be protected because they might be children, but that it is much more difficult to prevent professionals from using various substances in order to do their job. Conclusion: these interviews of cyclists in the 1960s allows us to understand a number of things. First, that one cannot think of doping in the past using present definitions. Secondly, in the 60s, the definitions of doping were fuzzy because they were in the middle of the construction process. Thirdly, one might be tempted to believe that today this fuzziness has disappeared. This is partly true since the current definition of doping is fixed by the World Anti-Doping Agency. But what is surprising is that the limits of doping are still being questioned. For example, what is legitimate or not in terms of medical care or pharmacological support with regeneration products continues to be debated. This introduction to the module through practical example of uncertainty around the definition of doping helps to better understand the process that led to making doping an important issue, an issue we'll talk about in the next videos.